history, we want to be the earliest, the first, the oldest. In matters of economic development, we want to be the fastest moving. In terms of statues, we want to be the tallest. It is very refreshing and sobering to hear a man who had a certain stature describe himself as a very ordinary man. I have added the very. He didn't use the very. It was here in this city on the 30th of January 1946, his last visit to Chennai. He was at the Hindi Prasar Sabha in T Nagar. And he says there was a gathering of 1,500 Congress workers. 1,500 Congress workers is a large number. He had his fads. He had the bees in his bonnet. His bonnet was actually something like a apiary. It had many bees. One of them was Hindi. And he decided to speak in Hindi. Singularly unfair. 1,500 and he's speaking in Hindi. At the end of his speech, he says, "How many of you followed what I said?" Only 50 hands went up out of the 1,500. I mean, look at the honesty of this city. Many people could have raised their hands and said, "I understood you," but no. Only 50 raised their hands. And then he looked and he found one person who had also not raised his hand. Who was that? It was one of the most honest of persons, Kamaraj. Kamaraj did not raise his hand. So he said, "Oh, so you also did not raise his hands?" He did not raise his hand. Then, like here, questions were called. And one person asked him a question. What is our future? And after having pulled him up for asking the question in English, he answered and he said, "I do not know the future. Only God knows the future of India. I am an ordinary man." I'll tell you how ordinary he was. Like most of us in this hall, he knew what fear meant. As a small boy, he knew the fear of creepy crawlies, the fear of the dark, fear of the night. And he was married at a very young age, the age of 13, to a girl, Kastur, who was also 13. She knew no fear. He says she would walk out in the dark. She had no fear. But I was a fearful boy. And there was a maid in the house, a housekeeper called Rambha. And she told him when he was shivering in fear, "Look, say the name of Rama and you will not be afraid." So at a very young age, he became aware of something called Rama. Now, what that Rama is, he has not defined very clearly. But it was very clear that this Rama made him face up to things that made him fearful, that made him worried. There were two things which he came not to fear. One was defeat, and the other was death. Again, like most of us, he had faced and experienced physical intimidation. But in his case, the intimidation went beyond intimidation. It led to actual assault. It is not often known, or not very widely known, and not often said, that in South Africa, he was almost beaten to death by a group of youth, all of them white South Africans, all of them presumably Christians, for espousing the cause of the Indian South Africans and for what they thought was bringing in large numbers of Indians on ships as potential immigrants to South Africa. And he says that he was beaten, pelted with rotten eggs. He held on to the railings of a house on the street he was walking in and left when they thought he was dead. But he, being an ordinary man, says, if they had continued to beat me and I had lost grip of my railings, I would have probably slapped them in return, even bitten them. Let us not think he was beyond self-defense. He says, I might have slapped them or bitten them. But the extraordinary thing about this ordinary man follows, and that again connects to what Rambha had told him. He says, even then, in my heart, I did not arraign my assaulters. Few years later, in the same city, when he had come to an arrangement with General Smuts on fingerprinting for Indian South Africans as a token of their rights, he had first opposed fingerprinting. But then he said, if the fingerprinting is not made compulsory but is voluntary, let us give our fingerprints. But there was one man, a Pathan called Mir Alam, who was infuriated. He said, you told us to resist fingerprinting. Now you are saying fingerprinting is all right if it is voluntary. I will not give my fingerprints. Moreover, I will not allow others to give their fingerprints. So when Gandhi was going to give his fingerprints under the voluntary scheme, Mir Alam followed him to the registration office and hit him with a cudgel on his head, on his face, on his ribs. And Gandhi says, all I remember is I lost my consciousness, but as I lost my consciousness, I said, Hey Ram. Fast forward to 1946, 47, 48. He faced physical threats wherever he went. He carried the bruises which he had suffered in South Africa in his memory, not in his body. But he was ever prepared to meet death. But the death, not of some extraordinary person, but of a very ordinary man. For he felt that in those 2.5 years, the run-up to independence, thousands, especially women, were being subject to merciless violence. When he went to Noakhali in what then was still East Pakistan, then still East Bengal, about to become East Pakistan, he said he went because of what was happening to the women in those areas. There were occasions when hands could have been laid on him, but were not. But in Kolkata, it nearly happened. What was to happen in Delhi was to happen a little later. But defeat and death held no fear to the man. But there was something else also which held no fear to him. Again, I think, thanks to what Rambha had said to him. He says, in a reply to a question posed to him in 1915, 1-5, by Indulal Yagnik, a labor leader, as to whether he expected any following for what he was doing, civil disobedience. He said, and I quote, "I am not very much worried about securing a large following. That will come in due course. But I do anticipate that a time may come when my large following may throw me overboard on account of my strict adhesion to my principles. And it may be that I shall almost be turned out on the streets and have to beg for a piece of bread from door to door." Unquote. I may have to beg for a piece of bread from door to door. This was his view of what lay ahead of him in terms of following, in terms of support. He had no illusions about his stature. He had no illusions about his being able to sway the masses of India. He did not think he could or he would. But in the same country that I was speaking about, in South Africa, Nelson Mandela described Gandhi as the man who had shown to South Africa disciplined mass struggle. This is Mandela talking. Disciplined mass struggle. And that is what he gave to India. And that is what gave to his movement propulsion. In South Africa, he had the support of 2,000, mark the number, 2,000 workers on the plantation fields, mines, and factories of South Africa, almost all of whom were of Tamil and Telugu origin. On his way back after the Smuts-Gandhi agreement, when a large amount of the demands of the Indian South Africans had been met, large amount, not all, but a large amount, he returned to India via London, where he wanted to meet Gokhale, his mentor. In London, Sarojini Naidu, who happened to be present and met him for the first time, organized a meeting at the Hotel Cecil, which does not exist anymore. It is chastening to remember and note that in that audience were three outstanding Indians: Lala Lajpat Rai, Bhupendranath Bosu, who was the then president of the Congress, and none other than Muhammad Ali Jinnah. These were among those who had gathered to meet this man who had done some extraordinary work in South Africa, and his wife, who had with him done some extraordinary things. Nobody knew then what the future held for Gandhi, but they were there thanks to the imagination of Sarojini Naidu. And Gandhi says that he stood and spoke before that audience and said that Kastur and I are being acknowledged for what we have done, But the real heroes and heroines of the Indian struggle in South Africa are not us, are not I or Kastur. They are Harbat Singh, Narayana Swami, a lad, as he called him, from South Africa, who was interned and then deported, and who came back because he wanted to be back in South Africa and died of starvation. And Nagappan, another Tamil youth who suffered similarly and died. And then his voice softening, he says, and Valliyamma of Tillayadi in Tanjavur district, who was in the same prison as Kastur and who was so ill and almost on her deathbed when she was released only to die. And he says in his words, it is these people, not I and not Kastur, but it is these people, the salt of the earth, as he calls them, on whom will be built the future nation that is India. And it is therefore very appropriate that we heard in the last session how important it is that these people who do not form part of the corporate leaders of India's GDP growth, but who are the salt of the earth, who we need to protect. For it is they still who are going to make the India that Gandhi was wanting to dream of. As an ordinary man, he knew the extraordinary power of ordinary people. This is the story of the man whom we need to remember at a time when supremacy, immaculacy, and a kind of self-exempting self-glorification is what claims our attention. Gandhi in Noakhali and in Bihar demanded of the people who were being violent to ordinary people that they surrender themselves not only to the authorities but to the duties of citizenship. It was in these two theaters, again, in Bihar, for instance, speaking to a group of congressmen, yes, to congressmen, he said, tell me, how many of you were responsible for the butchering of this 103-year-old woman? Silence. He said, I have been told that some of you participated in such violence. Tell me, who was responsible? Silence. And then he said, I shall go and ask her bones to tell me who among you was responsible. And in Noakhali, where the victims and the perpetrators of violence were of the opposite kind, he said remarkably what any ordinary man would to the women of Noakhali. Look, if you must take up arms. You must not hesitate to do so to protect yourselves. And he told the men there, remember, I am here without any security. So are these people without any security. I want the Hindus of East Bengal to remain in this village, and you must guard them. You must guard them. Some of them agreed. Large numbers of them were silent. And that is when those who are interested in music would be interested to know that he said, Manu, you sing now. You sing Raghupati Raghava Rajaram. But remember the old version. And she did. And in the village of Paniyali in East Bengal, Raghupati Raghava Rajaram got that extraordinarily powerful second line in the second verse. Ishvara Allah Tere Naam. And Ishvara Allah Tere Naam. Like Netaji's Jai Hind is his contribution to the lyrics of India's Renaissance. Ishvara Allah Tere Naam. I will come again to those concluding times. We remember the 30th of January, but no less important is the 20th of January 1948, 10 days before the assassination. He was at prayer. And his prayer included a small discourse. During the course of his speech, which has been recorded by All India Radio in a magical recording, which we can all hear on YouTube, he is talking softly with his lisp, which makes it difficult to understand him fully, and perhaps not everyone was understanding him even otherwise. One hears a small explosion, not a big explosion, nothing like what we hear on Deepavali nights, but a small explosion recorded by All India Radio. And then suddenly one hears a lot of agitated birds, perhaps crows. And then he says, in Hindi, which I will translate, अरे कुछ नहीं हुआ है, कुछ नहीं हुआ है, अगर सचमुच में कुछ हो जाए तो क्या करोगे? Nothing has happened. Nothing has happened. If something were to really happen, what would you do? And then he says, Manu, ab tum gao. And she sings, Ishvara Allah Tere Naam. At that time, an elderly woman in the gathering, felicitously named Sulochana, the one of the blessed eyes, spotted the man who had ignited the bomb. And he was taken in custody. Gandhi returns to his room, and his secretary Pyarelal, who has recorded this in his book, The Last Phase, Pyarelal says, Bapu, we are told that it was a very agitated young man venting his frustration. And Gandhi says, no. Don't you realize that there is a conspiracy behind this? Now the ordinary man gave way to the former barrister and lawyer. There was a conspiracy. On the 21st, the next day, he makes the most extraordinary speech. Extraordinary speech. I heard that the man behind the explosion had been arrested. An illiterate woman had displayed courage in having the man arrested. I admired her courage. Those who are behind him, the man who has been arrested, those who are behind him or whose tool he is, should know that this sort of thing will not save Hinduism. Rama is what I started with. A little earlier than this, the previous year in fact, in one of his prayer meetings, he was constantly interrupted whenever Ishwara Allah came up. And at one of those meetings, the young man who interrupted him stood up and said things beyond objection. And Gandhi stood up also and went towards him. And he says, there was nothing between him and me. Nothing between him and me. Nobody between him and me. This was the state of the security arrangements around the man whom Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose, no one else, had described as the father of the Indian nation. The father of the Indian nation is not a description which he ever accepted or which he ever liked being used. But I think he liked the fact that somebody who had been described as the father of the Indian nation by none other than Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose should not have anyone between him and the man who was protesting against him. A few days later, there was again nobody between him and the man who stood with a beretta in his hands. There was nobody true between the two. But I have no doubt that he looked into his assassin's eyes, for there were 2 or 3 moments of what can only be described as Greek tragedy. The man with the beretta, impassioned as he was, deeply committed to his beliefs, violently nudged Manu, whose hands dropped the rosary and the bhajanavali that she was holding, and they fell. And I have no doubt, and nobody can doubt this, that the 79-year-old saw his grandniece being nudged, the rosary falling, and looking at the man to a point when he could not look at him any longer. There was nobody between the two, but there indeed was. As Rambha had told him, there was Rama. Rama, in the last words uttered by him, came between the two. Not just to tell the 79-year-old what he had been told when he was probably 7 or 9, don't be afraid, but also what he had remembered in South Africa, not to arraign his assailants. The last spoken sentence of his, the last spoken sentence is what he said to Abha and Manu. He was late that day by a few minutes. And he said to them in Gujarati, "Mane modu thatu gamtu nathi. I do not like being late. I hate being late." And a great Sicilian philosopher, dramatizing this, knowing that Gandhi had told his people, "I do not accept the partition of India. Mr. Jinnah is wrong. He wants to divide the country on the basis of religion. I want to keep the country united on the basis of shared faith. He is wrong. Partition on my dead body." But partition had happened. Thousands had died. And so in a sense, he was late. And this Sicilian has dramatized the last moments to say that he looked at his assassin. This is imagination, not history. This is fiction, not fact. But it has the truth and the honesty of spiritual insight. Vastu says, he looked at his assassin and said, "Oh, but you are late. Today, the question that we must ask ourselves is it too late for this subcontinent of India? Is it too late for South Asia? I believe it is not. I believe it is not. For the reason that whenever there has been violence in the name of religion, there has been extraordinary redemptive action by people who do not ascribe to that violence. In Shantiniketan was an extraordinary sculptor called Somnath Hore, and he has made this piece of art, which is a piece of wonder in bronze, of two men in the embrace of death together, one belonging to one, the other to the other faith. They have the confidence, the veracity, and the grace of mutual trust and of respect. That faith in Somnath Hore's work of art is the faith that sustains the faith of this ordinary man who believed his wife was made of stronger fiber than he was, in not being afraid, but who himself says he learned his fearlessness from Rambha and his satyagraha from Kasturba. How? For she told him in South Africa when he had launched his great struggle against a certain set of very discriminating laws, that if women are to join the struggle, I will too. And he said, are you sure, Kastur? She said, I am sure, and I know whether you are sure or not, I am going to join the satyagraha. And he said, if you are so sure, go ahead. And she was sentenced to 3 months rigorous imprisonment, hard labor, and hard labor in those days in South Africa meant hard labor. In her case, it meant laundry work in the prison, washing the laundry of fellow prisoners, which she did without murmur. That Kastur, that Valliyamman, and the countless nameless women in both the countries who suffered and yet overcame the travails let loose upon them by partition, are the salt of the earth that he spoke of as an ordinary man. An ordinary man was his self-description. And today, when the highest, the fastest, the tallest, the greatest, the mightiest call for attention, this honest and very ordinary man does not call for attention. He does not even call for acceptance. He just calls for gentle recollection, for being ordinary and yet doing extraordinary things is what he has shown to be the secret of the success and the strength, and more than success and strength, of the sheer genius of our unhappy and yet absolutely extraordinary and unique land.